Happy New Year to everyone. Welcome to 2025. I am very excited for what we have in store for you in the coming year here on Global Dispatches. 2025, believe it or not, will be our 12th year of the show. I know there are some of you out there who have been listening to this show from the very beginning, so thank you. And for those of you who are newer to the show, thank you as well. I do what I do for you, all of you. And I really like bringing you the kind of expert interviews that make you a better informed person in your life and your work. The core of this audience are people who are somehow professionally engaged in foreign policy and international affairs in one way or another. So it brings me just great joy knowing that I'm helping decision makers make better decisions in one way or another. And I especially love shining a spotlight on undercovered global stories that perhaps some more maybe mainstream outlets tend to overlook. I think it's important, and the fact that this show still exists after all these years is a testament to the fact that there's an audience out there that really cares about these issues as much as I do. So again, thank you. So today's episode is something of a crossover from my other show, To Save Us From Hell. This is a new podcast we started last summer about the UN, in which co-host Anjali Dayal and I chat about all things United Nations. Anjali is a bona fide UN expert who studies and teaches the UN as a professor of international relations at Fordham, and someone I've long turned to for trenchant analysis of the UN. I am so grateful now to have the opportunity to regularly catch up with her and record our chats for a podcast listening audience. It's been fun. In today's episode, we do a United Nations year in preview. That is, what are some of the key issues, stories, and trends that will shape the UN in 2025? The show has its own separate feed, which can be accessed at globaldispatches.org or by following the links in the show notes here. Full episodes of To Save Us From Hell are behind a paywall, but not to fear, we are running a promotion for 40% off a full subscription to Global Dispatches, which gets you full access to Save Us From Hell, as well as my own writings on foreign policy and international affairs. Just this week, I wrote something about the real-world implications of Trump's very dumb musings about annexing Canada. You can unlock that content again by getting a paid subscription to Global Dispatches, and you would also be very much helping this show and, frankly, helping me personally as I work as hard as ever in 2025 to help you make sense of the world. So again, you can get a 40% discount by following the links in the show notes of this episode or by going to globaldispatches.org. Thank you. Now here is my conversation with Anjali Dayal about the UN in 2025. Enjoy. These ideas, and I include in that the annexation of Canada as the 51st state, are like laughably dumb, but they do have real world impact. Welcome to Save Us From Hell, a podcast about the United Nations. I am your co-host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I run Global Dispatches, and this very podcast, To Save Us From Hell, is a project of Global Dispatches.
And I'm Anjali Dayal. I'm an associate professor of international politics at Fordham University in New York, and I teach and I do research and I write about the United Nations.
Anjali, we are speaking Wednesday, January 8th. I don't know if the statute of limitations on wishing you and everyone a happy new year has been expired, but regardless, I'll say happy new year to you, Anjali, and to all our listeners out there.
Happy New Year to you, too. I think the statute runs all the way through January, or at the very least, all the way through Capricorn season.
Okay, good. Now, I'm an Aquarius, so by the time my birthday hits later this month, it'll be expired. But I don't know, is this going to be a happy new year for the United Nations? That's what we're going to discuss. We are going to have a long conversation today about what to expect from the UN in 2025, a United Nations 2025 year in preview. And I could think of no better venue at the United Nations to kick off than the Security Council. A new year brings a new composition to the Security Council, Anjali, as new members rotate in and old members rotate off of their 2-year cycle. And in 2025, we have leaving the Security Council Ecuador, Japan, Malta, Mozambique, and Switzerland. The newly elected non-permanent members for 2025 to 2026 are Denmark, Greece, Pakistan, Panama, and Somalia. What say you, Anjali, of who's leaving and who's coming?
Well, that means that the elected membership of the Security Council in full now is Algeria, Denmark, Greece, Guyana, Pakistan, Panama, the Republic of Korea, Sierra Leone, Slovenia, and Somalia. And I would say, taken together, this is a really interesting group of states, some of which are some of the key underwriters of big parts of the contemporary UN system, and some of which are active participants in some of what will be the pressing crises facing the Security Council, I think, in the year ahead.
Okay, do explain. Take us down both those paths.
Yeah, so, if we look at states that have really placed at the center of some of their foreign policies contemporary multilateralism and the UN in particular, Sierra Leone and Slovenia have been incredibly active participants in debates about the future of the Security Council and debates about the future of the UN system over the last year. We would expect that to continue. Guyana as well has been at the center of some of the sort of most pressing humanitarian debates at the Security Council, as has been the Republic of Korea. Now, looking ahead, right, there are some issues related to Somalia and in particular the joint financing of peace operations that probably loom ahead for the Security Council. Somalia has just joined the Security Council. If we think about a future Trump presidency, which is sort of knocking on all of our collective doors as we record this, then the promised acquisition of Panama by the Trump administration, well, obviously, far-fetched as an idea, is a fundamental challenge to the very fabric of contemporary international order as it lives in the UN Charter. And so
Yeah.
we luckily have Panama on the Security Council as well.
And Denmark on the
Yeah,
Security Council. And there's the other potential territorial acquisition
right.
that's been proposed by the Trump administration of Greenland. And look, these ideas, and I include in that the annexation of Canada as the 51st state, are like laughably dumb, but they do have real world impact. These may seem like kind of Trump being Trump here in the US, but they are sparking debate and discussion and consternation in key countries like Panama and Denmark, which now sit on the Security Council.
That's right.
And I do wonder if these remarks by Trump and these actions by Trump will in fact impact U.S. diplomacy at the Security Council, where again, two of the new members are Denmark and Panama, and Trump has been promising to try to acquire somehow the Panama Canal in Greenland.
I mean, on the one hand, we have sort of priced in the fact that he just says stuff, that he wakes up and he says bonkers things. On the other hand, diplomacy is the art of saying things, and speech by the president is meaningful. And so both of those things work together to, I think, sort of play out in a forum where the key unifying principle that everybody agrees on is sovereign non-intervention and territorial integrity.
Yeah.
And we should, I think, be mindful of the fact that we need to pace ourselves, right? It's going to be like this every day for the next 4 years. He's just going to say stuff. But on the other hand, it is consequential to these states. Justin Trudeau yesterday posted that there was not a snowball's chance in hell that Canada would become the 51st state. I think, for a Canadian leader to break out not a snowball's chance in hell is strong language.
And the likely next prime minister, Pierre Poilievre,
Mm-hmm.
also said something to that effect as well. And look, I mean, again, we kind of laugh it off here in the US, but I made a point in a recent edition of my Global Dispatches newsletter that these comments really do undermine American soft power, right? Like one enduring source of American soft power is that the United States does not have like territorial disputes with its neighbors or designs for territorial expansion. And this is opposed to, say, China, which has territorial disputes with nearly all of its neighbors and is an enduring point of weakness in its ability to wield soft power. Now, soft power does make a difference. And I would imagine, for example, that in the coming year, there will be key debates and discussions at the Security Council. There will be a moment when Denmark and Panama, for example, have to decide how they will vote on an issue and if they want to back the United States on an issue that might be potentially polarizing or unpopular or contentious in their own domestic political environments. And will the leaders of Denmark and Panama want to take a decision that might potentially align themselves with the United States when their populace might be really kind of wary of the United States? And these are kind of real world implications, real world consequences of these dumbass remarks by Trump.
There's a tendency to think of soft power as like a cultural cachet, right? But if we think of this kind of power as actually being diplomatic capital, right? It is the case that the US, no matter how powerful militarily, cannot get everything it wants by force. Not in the least because some of the things that it wants require the willing participation and consent of other states, which you cannot get by hitting someone on the head repeatedly, right? At some point, they have to acquiesce to help you. And it is harder to get those things in a world where you have set yourself up to be in opposition to their fundamental principles, but also to their sovereign territorial integrity and to their sovereign right to choose their policies. That's, I think, before we get to the actual hard power considerations that follow from this, which is, first of all, what is American policy when the key American foreign policy decision maker advocates for territorial acquisition,
Mm.
advocates for conquest and invasion explicitly first. Second, when we think about what the UN system is, right? It is a compact between states that outlaws aggressive warfare being invasion and territorial acquisition. If those principles do not underwrite the UN Charter, nothing does. And so, in that sense, right, if we think of the UN Charter as being in descent from a long line of international law that seeks to outlaw war, right, going back to Kellogg Briand on downwards, then the way the outlawing of war works today is explicitly by making things like invasion and territorial acquisition seem ridiculous. The
Yeah.
reason we laugh at it is because it's hard to imagine us living in a world where that's the norm again.
And like Russia already pierced that armor through its invasion of Ukraine in
That's
2022.
right.
And that's why you saw such like a profound international response to Ukraine's defense and Russia's invasion. Why you saw countries, at least initially in the global south, really profoundly concerned because, that principle, the idea that one country shouldn't take the territory of another neighboring country by force is like fundamental to their own national survival. And so that's part of like why you saw this outpouring of support for Ukraine, which has been limited for another of other reasons recently, but at least initially, that's what kind of drove international condemnation of Russia's actions.
And that's also how we know that this is still the most popular principle at the UN. It's right through this sort of whipping of votes in support of Ukraine and through the sort of public statements of small states, of states that are not necessarily reflexively aligned with the United States, all getting up to say, look, everybody has a neighbor that they're scared of. Everybody has a bigger neighbor that they don't want to be acquired by. But also, if we think back to the sort of early days of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the very passionate defenses from African states of Ukraine's sovereign right to exist shows us that this is still a unifying principle of the UN system, despite the many hypocritical ways states may behave in other arenas. And I just want to also note that this is different. There's an argument, right, that the US's invasion of Iraq is another fundamental challenge to the UN Charter, and that is true. But the US explicitly makes that argument by pulling on another body of international law, by saying, because we are concerned about Iraqi violations of different weapons conventions. We are therefore going to do that. And first, we're going to go to the UN. And when that doesn't work, we're going to invade anyway. But that's a different set of acts, right? It says, look, these bodies of law both exist. We're going to push on one and therefore claim that we're underwriting the other. That's not what Donald Trump is doing. He's just saying, why not be a 19th century imperialist?
So we'll certainly get into this more in the conversation, but one of the key variables that will impact how the UN works in 2025 will, of course, be the capricious nature of Donald Trump and the unpredictable nature of his foreign policy. And we'll cover that, not only today and the implications today, but throughout the year, of course. But Anjali, before we leave this discussion about the Security Council in 2025, I did want to ask you about Somalia. Really interesting case and an interesting member of the Security Council for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, I mean, particularly in the coming year, something for us to look at is that at the end of last year, in 2024, the Security Council passed a resolution on the prospect of UN funding for the new African Union operation in Somalia, the African Union Support and Stabilization Mission in Somalia, which is supposed to start in the middle of 2025. It's something that isn't necessarily popular with Republican members of the US Congress, right? But this mechanism, this joint funding mechanism, where the UN funds an AU-led mission is something that's been sort of on the table increasingly for the last couple of years, explicitly through a series of sort of formalized resolutions from the UN Security Council. It also does lead us, I think, to something else that we want to talk about in terms of the Security Council, which is in the middle of the year, like in May, I believe, there's going to be another ministerial level conference on peacekeeping. And something that's sort of in the shadow of the big closures of the last year of UN peacekeeping missions, but on the cusp of understanding that a number of the UN's political missions have been taking up functions that have traditionally been assigned to UN peacekeeping missions. At Crisis Group, Daniel Forti and Richard Gowan made the point that we're at the point where we're in need of new ideas for peacekeeping, but it's often the case that when UN peacekeeping has suffered its biggest setbacks, it's also experienced sort of more and more innovation. So we shouldn't count it out just now. It will, I think, remain to be seen what the Security Council wants to do vis-a-vis these missions.
So that'll be a key thing to watch in 2025 is the evolution of UN peacekeeping and this ministerial meeting in May. I guess maybe, Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, might participate. Who knows? Is going to be a key inflection point that will kind of set the stage for how UN peacekeeping evolves over the next few years. But one important input into the viability of UN peacekeeping and the UN in general is how the UN funds itself. So the way the UN funds itself is essentially how any membership-based organization does. It charges dues payments to its members. Member states are members of the United Nations organization, and they pay for that privilege, right? And the amount that they pay is negotiated every 3 years by the member states themselves in really very in the weeds, deep negotiations that essentially is based on a few different criteria, the most important of which is the size of a country's economy. So the United States has historically been the largest funder of the United Nations, and the United Nations also splits their assessment scales. They charge separate assessments for the UN regular budget, which funds things like, operations at the UN headquarters, paying for salaries for the utility bills, things like that. And then UN peacekeeping is charged separately, which funds UN's peacekeeping's operation around the world. And again, every 3 years, the UN member states get together to figure out how in the 3 coming years, they will charge themselves for the privilege of being members of the United Nations. And a new scale of assessments is out and kicks off on January 1st this year, Anjali, and there are some surprising results.
So, we actually still have a stable ranking of who's funding the UN at what rates, but there are significantly increased contributions from, in particular, China. Do you want to explain that to us, Mark?
Yeah. So, look, the US, again, has for the last many years paid about 22% of the UN regular budget and about 26% of UN peacekeeping. China has been, again, for the last 10 years, the second largest contributor. But this year, it is still the second largest contributor, but its rates have shot up by about 30%. So it is now paying about 20% of the UN regular budget, an increase of about 31%, and about 23% of the UN peacekeeping budget, which is an increase of about 27% of its previous assessed dues. So China has been for the last decade or so the second largest contributor, but now its share has increased just substantially, which I think really potential important implications for the ability of China to wield influence at the United Nations in 2025 and beyond.
Eugene Chen of NYU had a terrific breakdown of this on Blue Sky. One thing for us to note is that this isn't a system like the IMF, where the number of dollars you contribute translates directly to the number of votes you have. But it actually is almost the reverse. The idea being that those countries that derive an outsized benefit from the UN system and can afford it should fund the UN system at greater levels. And therefore, the 5 permanent members of the United Nations disproportionately fund its budget because they derive disproportionate benefit from the UN system. And in this particular case, a sort of more even scale where China is contributing almost as much as the United States is interesting on the one hand in the fact that both countries tend to be in arrears paying their actual contributions, which is why the UN is so budget strapped, right? It's not actually overspending its budget. It's overspending the budget that its key members refuse to contribute to on time.
That's an important thing to discuss in a moment, but continue.
Yeah. But in theory, we have talked in the past about how the UN is unusually sensitive to the dynamics of US domestic politics because of its outsized reliance on the US to fund its budget. An increase in Chinese contributions doesn't necessarily blunt that reliance, unfortunately. It just means that the UN is also, therefore, more sensitive to Chinese domestic politics. And that's because both these countries are contributing a staggering amount of the UN's budget. If we wanted the UN to be less sensitive to the domestic politics or the foreign policy projects of either of these countries, we would need other countries to contribute almost as much as these two countries.
So, one consequence of America's longstanding role as the top contributor to the UN budget, like by far, is that it tends to get some key posts around the United Nations. Like the head of the World Food Program is Cindy McCain. I would imagine that Donald Trump will block Cindy McCain's reappointment given her political alliance with the Biden administration and Joe Biden. So there'll be an opening at some point for a new World Food Program executive director. This has always gone to an American. This is a very high profile post as opposed to, say, the head of the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is currently held by a Chinese national. Will China want to go after some of those more high profile posts and positions around the United Nations now that they are a key contributor to the UN's regular budget and to UN peacekeeping?
Yeah, I mean, I think none of us know the answer for certain to that, but where I would look is actually not necessarily the big high profile positions, but the smaller positions.
Do tell.
The sort of appointment at different UN agencies of key personnel who are responsible for day-to-day practice, as opposed to sort of the big headline spokesperson and this is something that we talked to Courtney Fung about a couple of months ago when we asked her about the way China operates at the UN Security Council. And one of the things that she noted was that Chinese diplomats are very proud of the way that they successfully work behind the scenes to help advance Beijing's cause. So I think we would probably look both places. We might look at these big high profile appointments, but we might look at the sort of way that China might want more and more of its either selected Chinese personnel or other personnel that they view to be sort of more sympathetic to its foreign policy projects to occupy less sort of showy but very consequential posts. Things that
Mm.
are notable around the UN system, maybe, right? But like, people know who Cindy McCain is and what the World Food Program is and what the chief of the World Food Program is and does outside the confines of Turtle Bay. But we know as people who pay attention to this that the Cindy McCains of the world, while very important, are not necessarily the key places where distinct kinds of different policy agendas emerge at first.
Another aspect of this scale of assessment that was just released, and how the UN funds itself, that I think for the UN will be profoundly impactful, is the fact that it may accelerate and exacerbate a liquidity crisis that the UN already faces for a couple of reasons. Number one is that the US and China, for vague reasons that are not worth delving into, tend to pay their dues very late in the year. And these are the two largest funders of the UN by far. And so the UN kind of like is running on credit, running on fumes, and is really cash strapped until they get those large payments from the US and China towards the end of the year. So we're going to see that kind of liquidity crisis continue to, I think, exacerbate. And another additional pressure that is unique, I think, to the Trump administration is that the US is already about $1 billion in arrears to UN peacekeeping from actions taken during the Trump administration. Again, I said that US has assessed a UN peacekeeping contribution rate of around, let's say, 26, 27% of the peacekeeping budget. However, during the Trump era, Trump refused to pay more than 25% of the UN peacekeeping budget. And that gap over time led to the accumulation of arrears that the Biden administration has been trying to pay down. But here we have a situation for the next 3 years at least, in which the United States is going to be assessed at about 26%, but probably if it pays at all, and that's a big question, we don't really know what Trump will do, will pay less than that. And that, again, will contribute to a budget crunch at the United Nations that will impact operations.
And just to note, you note that the US is $1 billion in arrears on its peacekeeping budget. That's out of a budget of $6 billion.
Yes.
So this is not like 1 billion out of a budget of like 100 billion, right?
Yeah.
This is fully 1/6 of the UN's operational budget, which again is 0.5% of all global defense spending. This is a minuscule amount of money for enormous military powers like the US and China, but it is a hugely consequential amount in terms of the UN's actual ability to field and run these operations.
Mm-hmm. And also, can you give us some context? What's the UN's like regular budget as well? We've been talking about percentages, but haven't given actual numbers.
The UN's budget, this is actually something that's been running for, I would say, maybe 15 years at this point, which is that the peacekeeping budget is almost twice the regular budget of the UN. The General Assembly approved a $3.72 billion budget for 2025. We should note that this is a really small number.
Yes.
$3.72 billion. That's like a sneeze for Jeff Bezos. And the whole organization runs on that. And presumably like chewing gum, rubber bands, and good wishes, because that's nothing to run a global organization.
Yeah. And again, that's why we kind of focus on American contributions, because it's the largest, and now China's contributions because it's now the second largest and accounts for more than 20% of both the regular and the peacekeeping budgets. That's why our focus on these two largest contributors is so important, because we're talking about like small budgets, but big portions of small budgets when we talk about American and Chinese contributions to the United Nations.
And the consequences of underfunding are immediate. They are both tragic and, on the other hand, comic, right? So they cover both ends of the spectrum. The World Food Program, which we were just talking about, counts the loss of its budget in terms of lost calories that are going to people who need food.
Mm-hmm.
The UN operational budget at the headquarters, in past years when they've run short, Antonio Guterres has made his point by stopping escalators from running and basically saying, like, look, you got to take the stairs because we can't pay this electricity bill. And so those two, like, I think, extremes of emotion, right? Both the horror and the sort of comedy of running an organization on such a small budget really come to the fore when your two key funders hold off on sending in their dues.
So, look, we've discussed the Security Council. We've discussed the regular UN budget and the UN peacekeeping budget. And, the through line between both these conversations is the unpredictability, the volatility of the incoming Trump administration, combined with heightened geopolitical tensions with China, which I presume you will agree will inform so many key moments and key decisions and key crises that the United Nations will face in 2025. So let's get into those.
Something that we've talked about over the last year is about the increasing tensions between Russia and the US, between the US and everybody else, and between Russia and everybody else at the UN Security Council. But as you said, one thing for us to look at is the way that increasing tensions between China and the US will play out over the course of trying to make sort of global conflict management and global conflict resolution work. We sort of reached a low point in consensus these last 2 years at the UN Security Council after a period of huge agreement after the Cold War. And as we look ahead to the next couple of years, we should expect that to continue with real consequences for people worldwide.
So let's get into that a bit. First, on like the volatile and unpredictable nature of the Trump administration. I mean, there are a few things that we can predict regarding the United Nations. Number one is that the global gag rule will be reinstated and that funding for the UN Population Fund will be eliminated. So the UN Population Fund will lose its largest funder. And there's always this question about whether or not other funders will step up. We know UNRWA will not receive U.S. funding going into the new year. And we can likely predict that, frankly, so long as Cindy McCain is head of the World Food Program, we can probably expect the Trump administration to reduce, withhold funding for the WFP. And again, the WFP, we should note, is not funded, as we discussed earlier, like the regular UN budget or the UN peacekeeping. It's funded through the voluntary contributions of its member states. So it's relatively easy for a administration to withhold funding from a organization like the WFP if it wanted to. We can expect UNRWA to continue to not receive U.S. funding, and we could probably expect at least a reduction of funding for UN humanitarian operations around the world, just at a time as humanitarian crises are expanding. And the UN will, again, have to adjust to this kind of new reality.
One thing we talked about when we talked just after Election Day and with the sort of naming of Elise Stefanik as Trump's UN ambassador is that a lot will depend on where Elise Stefanik sees her fortunes lying most fruitfully. Whether she finds them most fruitful in sort of investing in her own diplomatic relationships or in being Trump's whip. And a lot will depend on how Antonio Guterres works to manage his relationship with Trump and Stefanik. Something that we saw over the first Trump presidency was, of course, Nikki Haley is a committed liberal internationalist in a way that Stefanik and Trump are not, obviously. But still, she came into the office with a commitment to shave down the UN's budget and to shave down the peacekeeping budget. And one way that Guterres worked with her was in trying to harness that energy for reform and essentially saying, I agree with you that this institution needs to change. And to some extent, in repackaging some of the efforts that they were trying to already make in terms of reform as concessions to the Trump administration. And so one place for us to look in 2025 is how people essentially try and play ball with the Trump administration, right? What ways they frame their efforts and
Hmm.
what ways they don't reframe their efforts. And I think one thing to note also is that coming to the UN on the tail end of the Biden administration with its oppositional relationship to a lot of different parts of the UN and a lot of different sort of UN member states is a very different thing than coming to the UN at the end of an Obama administration, where
Yeah.
there were more full-fledged multilateral projects that had more UN interests at base. So what US interests are might in fact be more consistent across the end of the Biden presidency and the Trump transition.
Yeah, I mean, and let's like kind of address the elephant in the room, which is Gaza,
Yeah.
and the U.S.'s and the Biden administration's position on Gaza profoundly alienated it from the rest of the UN membership and really eroded goodwill towards the United States that might have existed because Biden is like a jovial guy with longstanding
Yeah.
internationalist credentials who personally knows a lot of these world leaders. But the fact is that America's diehard support for Israel as Israel embarked on its destruction of Gaza really alienated much of the UN members against American leadership. And Trump doesn't seem like willing or interested in being that kind of swaggering American leader at the United Nations that, say, a Democratic administration or even like the previous administration was. He's inheriting a diminished American standing at the United Nations to start with.
He is, and it obviously remains in the interest of other states and of the UN Secretariat to keep the US invested. The question is, at what cost? And with what willing partner? And we don't know what kind of willingness, I think, yet that Elise Stefanik will have to
Mhm.
work with the Secretariat. We shouldn't expect.
To continue listening to this episode and access all future episodes of To Save Us From Hell, please visit globaldispatches.org and get a paid subscription, or you can click the link in the show notes of this episode. And I hope you will continue listening and support the show. Thank you for listening to Save Us From Hell. The show is co-hosted by me, Mark Leon Goldberg, and Anjali Dayal. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. Our cover art is by Sarah D. Michelle. If you've not already done so, please subscribe to our show via Substack at globaldispatches.org. We are sustaining this show by selling subscriptions to it via Substack. You can get a discounted subscription by going to globaldispatches.org/save us. You can follow the link in the show notes as well. And finally, if you'd like to discuss this episode with us, please visit globaldispatches.org and click on chat, where we'll be around to discuss what we discussed in this episode. Thanks, and be sure to tell friends and colleagues about To Save Us From Hell, a new podcast about the United Nations.